3 months ago, I had the pleasure of giving a lecture at the Mohammed bin Hamad AlSharqi Council in the city of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. The topic presented was about how the past can influence identity, in this case, an Arab Muslim identity. It echoed my personal journey in finding out more about who I was. The overall experience was wonderful, made even more amazing by the fantastic people of Fujairah, led by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Hamad AlSharqi, the Crown Prince of Fujairah. Parts of the lecture contextualize the topic towards a Gulf Arab audience, but nonetheless, the message at its core is universal. I hope you enjoy it and can't wait to read your comments and insights.
In any situation, coming up with a lecture or talk can be a daunting task, especially when it's a substantial amount of people that are going to be listening, like today. When you add the condition that this talk has to be approximately an hour long, the situation becomes even more challenging. That's typically 4 to 5 times longer than I usually take for my talks. From the outset, I was a little outside of my comfort zone, and in order for me to get back into my comfort zone, I chose to talk about something that is very close to my heart, a topic I've been speaking about for the past 2 years now, and that's learning from the past. But even then, when I started contemplating the main discussion points of the talk, I came to realize that it was still a fairly wide open topic. I could easily go on and get lost with an unfocused monologue that would result in an uninspiring experience for both you, the audience, and for myself, the speaker. So it was necessary for me to zoom into my thoughts and hone my eventual topic even further, fine-tune my approach so that the message being relayed was at its simplest and purest. When we look at how our past is important in shaping our present and future, we discover that there are 5 main takeaways from revisiting and learning from the past. The past offers us valuable lessons for shaping a better future. When studying history, it helps us to avoid repeating past mistakes. It assists us in recognizing patterns and cycles when looking back in hindsight, and enables us a better understanding of the present. When looking at the past, it gives us insights into human behavior and psychology, thereby revealing empathy and understanding. And finally, when we value looking back at the past, we look at preserving our cultural heritage that connects us to our roots and fosters a sense of identity. I want to mainly focus on the last takeaway while also addressing some elements of the fourth, the past and how it shapes our sense of hawiyya, identity, and how it helps us understand it. When I'm talking about hawiyya, it's not your Emirates ID I'm talking about, it's who you are, what makes you who you are. On that note, I believe it's imperative to start with defining identity. And this is a really important question. How do we explain what identity means to each and every one of us? There are many definitions that attempt to define what identity is. There are the psychological, the theological, and completely theoretic. I want to define it as simply as possible. Identity is the mental image of oneself. And this mental image is shaped by many intangible elements, such as beliefs, by values, by culture, and by the more real and tangible factors like our racial and ethnic makeup, and the many nuances that populate the fine gaps between these two worlds, the humor, the mannerisms, and so on. Identity also has a very malleable dynamic to its exposure. It's primarily about yourself, your person, but also within lies another dimension of identity that deals with a collective belonging with others who share a similar kind of essential character. It has to involve more than yourself because, after all, we identify with more than ourselves, with a group. Or else it's not identity we're talking about, that would be personality. And hence, identity operates on 2 fields, the personal and the communal. In the case of a majority of the audience today, you're all individuals. You're all members of your own family, your clan, your society, and you are Ahl al-Fujairah, and Emiratis, of course. Along with that, you're Muslim, you're Khaliji, and you're Arab. All these layers shape your identity and empower the connections you have with such larger-than-yourself groups. And it's within these connections is where you find the elements that shape your image. Not only in how these connections are today, no, and how they have been for years, decades, and possibly even centuries. And that, my friends, is the past. That is history. I hope we have a certain collective grasp on identity, so now let's define what I'm referring to when I mention the past. The past is the people, the events, the stories, the discoveries, the language, the arts, the music, and the vast amounts of ideas and expressions that have shaped us into who we are over the ages. The past is everywhere around us. The common things that might pass right before your eyes without giving them a second's thought. It's not just the seen history, not purely the facts. The events and the dates and their famous personalities that ultimately are the focus of one's recollection. That is what textbooks inform us about our history. The past, in our case, is much more than that. It is the reasoning behind the actions that have been taken throughout history. It's the study of the people and their behavior, virtually a psychological and sociological analysis. The elements that are most important and informative to us are the ones that are usually the most mundane. It is the larger concepts found within our past that give us a greater insight of why we are who we are. We look at the past to find the richness that comes with each and every layer I mentioned previously, that of family, that of clan or tribe, that of society, and that of a nation. But when we look back, what are we really looking back at? What are we examining? Typically, in recalling the past, we resort to the elements that impact our senses, the empirical data that triggers our memories. But in most instances, we don't understand or register what it is we're actually recalling. For example, we might look at Sedu and the geometric patterns that remind us of our Bedouin past and the cozy comforts of tents in the desert during the cold, dry evenings. Whereas when we think of Bukhur, it then triggers our sense of smell that takes us to recollections of celebratory times, or even the dhows that glided effortlessly across the sea during the days of pearl diving reminds us of a long-lost era of hardship and tragedy. More and more of these visual connections to our past do indeed serve our identity, but on a considerably less impactful level. Why? Because our analysis of them falls short. We look superficially and without an in-depth review of the relationships and backgrounds that are found within these physical reminders of our past. I'll be expanding on this point later on in our talk. So the past and its influence on identity is beyond immaterial. And the fact that having a powerful identity as imperative in our day and age is also beyond doubt, because without this sense of identity, this solidarity of a belonging, an individual has no real roots, no personal or collective narrative, and therefore no truly effective present or future. He or she feels estranged, separated from others, and the passing events around them are experienced as a series of unrelated, unimportant, and insignificant happenings. We need identity to ground us, to lock us into a firm position. And this challenge is further exacerbated by modernity's hyperdrive and subsequent of assimilation of culture, be it by invitation or by invasion. It's an undeniable reality that the retention of identity today is being impaired. And as time goes by, this situation might be further complicated with threats like globalization and the acceleration of technology that bring an immense contradictory momentum that is imminently going to examine our identity. Globalization, as much as it has positives, also comes with cultural challenges. And that is its impact on the uniqueness of identity. In addition, the ease of which the cross-pollination of ideas takes place through technology like social media can generate great conflict with one's own sets of beliefs and social systems. There are waves after waves of challenges that are confronting us and seeking to create great change amongst the identities around the world. and then in the diminishment of the differentiation of one people from another. So, is it enough to identify oneself as Arab, Muslim, or Emirati, Jordanian, Iraqi, or Egyptian? Or simply to have a clear understanding that one belongs to this society or that family, or this specific culture, heritage, or tradition? Is it enough that our identity is populated with comprehending that we share certain conservative values or hold high the importance of faith and community, and then be totally satisfied with that version of identity? I personally don't think that it's enough. I believe there is more to achieve and learn about what shapes us. And I believe that this search will only reflect positively on our ability to know who we truly are and who we can also become. So let's backtrack a little and examine how we achieve our versions of identity. First, it's our parents and families that start to shape what our identity is through their actions, statements, and overall behavior. We imitate, and then imitation becomes our identity construct. We copy and hence automatically know we should act and behave a certain way. We acknowledge that we belong to this very small group of similar people. Then it's the educational system that takes control of the next layer of self-image molding. We gain a newer understanding about social, political, and religious events, people, and experiences that speak of our past. Yet again, we don't really understand the why of it all. We're told we're this way, and that's it. No real explanations. And it's these exposures into identity through imitation first, and then afterwards education, that shape our formative understandings of who we are. Then we seem to decelerate the substantial growth and development of our identity after our education concludes. And if there's more progress introduced, it's nominal. Our identifying with ourselves and those of our collective acceleratingly slows down to a virtual stop. The past seems to take a tragic turn in its reputation in terms of providing us with answers, as the past becomes history. I think that's how many people, especially younger people, feel about the past, that it strictly belongs either to a different era or in the memory of their parents and grandparents, or maybe in museums that are to be visited every so often so that one may remind themselves that their identity does indeed have a history. History is not in the past, and the past is definitely not history. They both accompany us everywhere we go, and this history, this past and all its associations with our identity, we will hand down to our children, and the cycle goes on into perpetuity. But what's missing in our life experience is a more dynamic, personal, and autonomous approach to learning about our identity. When was the last time you intentionally thought about what makes you who you are? You see, we rarely consciously contemplate our identity. We assume that we are simply the way we are, and that's all we're ever going to be. A preset position formulated by a series of realizations of our lives that have been conditioned and influenced by events or behaviors that have taken place as early as a few seconds ago, and all the way back into the past when our ancestors lived their own versions of life back into antiquity.
In a race, there's a start, a middle, and an end. Each and every point is regulated by a series of edges. The start line is where we find ourselves in the moment, our present. The running lanes define the zone we must run within. They represent the ongoing journey, and a finish line that, let's just say, is our future, our ultimate goal that is constantly within our view, but is always either a little or a lot out of reach. In short, this is our journey of self, a race. And in the context of our talk, all these edges I speak of are our identity. The starting line is our base identity, our current foundation, including the sets of beliefs, ideas, behaviors, and belongings established over our lifetime so far that represent who we are. The lanes are an extension of our base and regulate our actions and reactions throughout life to scenarios, situations, and experiences. And the finish line is our identity ambition, how well we want to know ourselves, as well as how much we want to understand about the real reasons why we are the way we are. But for each of us, the edges can range in focus. Some who have a powerful identity, like many of you here, see their lines clearly. Their edges offer strong positions of reflection and reaction. You know who you are and where you stand. Whereas those who have lesser awareness of identity see things not so sharply. The edges are not true edges, they are out of focus. They dissolve into the field of view and hence offer little resistance, direction, feel, or foundation for opinion, response, or sympathy. The starting line is weak, whereas the lanes allow for running all across the track. And the finish line, well, because it's in the future, suffers with intensified blurriness. And it's with this lack of focus that people stray, go off course and into the wild where there are no tools to help them navigate a better understanding of themselves and hence of situations within life. All edges are important in the identity equation, and it's imperative that we refocus our identity lens so that the lines and edges of our identity redirect us towards our own ideal personal paths within our journey. Now, as if that isn't complicated enough, if we look at the larger scale, we realize that it's not a single lane we perceive. Within this race, there are many more races in parallel that we're involved in. And to expand on the simple track analogy, races such as this that represent identity involve tracks of many sizes. A single track echoing an individual journey, an official 8-lane track signifying a family, and then beyond, to where there are 1,000 lanes for a clan, 100,000 for a society, and then into the millions. These tracks are the various tracks we concurrently run in throughout our life. So it's not only about how we run within our own race and lane, but also how we run in races that are far larger than our individual self. How we add to the strength of our collective identity when our personal edges are sharper and more focused. How with our clearer knowledge of our identity, it empowers those around us, our siblings, our children, our families, our colleagues in establishing higher thresholds of their identities, and then onwards towards our growingly larger affiliated groups.
Identity also is a fairly dynamic element. It evolves not in the sense that it drastically changes per se, but in the fact that it's a malleable equation, one that can see significant clarifications with new realizations and understandings, with a new threshold of focus. And it's not about age being a contributing factor in necessitating intensifying identity either. Being a youth or an adult, it's a lifelong mission for us to continuously seek the refinement of our self-image so that we maintain its resilience, consciously thinking about identity, how we are, why we are the way we are, and how we got here. Why we act a certain way, what does it say about us? We have to look at these things with full intention so that we may start to understand who we truly are, what we stand for and represent, and why we do so. This will typically involve a review of our historic timelines, when we won't allow things to pass before our eyes without examining them further, to potentially extract and learn from the essences of our past to then understand ourselves better. I repeat, this is a conscious process that challenges the notion that identity is predefined within us. Yes, all components of our identity pre-exist. They are forever there in our past to discover. Yet, they won't all automatically appear and then come into focus, thereby elevating our understanding of self, unless we proactively discover it ourselves and gain the reasons for it being the way it is. And it's this journey that is necessary for all of us to uncover and introduce into our life, to engage with in a proactive and habitual manner. And this is what I want to personally share with you, my races, my journey of the rediscovery of my identity. To give you proper context to my journey of self-discovery, I have to start with my past, and I mean the very beginning. Growing up, I had a significant disadvantage identity-wise. You see, I didn't live a typical life. I was born outside of my home country, Kuwait. My parents were career diplomats that saw us move from one place to another. Every 3 to 5 years, we were somewhere new. People later on in life would ask me how it was. Was it weird for you? They'd say. I wouldn't know, I'd reply. It's the only life I know. There's nothing else I can compare it to. What was obvious was that there was no physical base to belong to early in my life. Our moves were unplanned destination-wise, but fortunately for my family, one positive coincidence that it was mainly Middle Eastern nations we mostly moved to, like Algeria, Iran, Syria, and then Egypt. Yet I believe during that time I still held on to a similar identity journey trajectory as would any other Kuwaiti child. My parents, as full-fledged Kuwaiti identities, did provide the opportunity for imitation of their actions and behavior that was necessary for a child of my age. My entry into education began the straying of my fledgling identity. You see, although mainly living in Arab lands, I was enrolled into a Western educational school system, the bias of which I would struggle with for many years to come. When I say bias, I mean the engagement with Westerners and their behavior and beliefs on a recurrent basis, and the subjects and methods that I would be educated in that would move me away from my identity, not with any maliciousness, but with the telling of many stories that were not mine. Eventually, in the midst of my teenage years, this situation created a longing in me, a void in my being where I felt something important was missing in who I was. Initially and subconsciously, this was sustained by attempts to link myself with elements of my Kuwaiti and Arab culture. Newspapers, music, theater, television, and so on. But at a certain point later on in adulthood, these interim solutions just weren't enough. Digging deeper was necessary for me in revealing more fundamental elements of my identity and also in understanding the gaps I had still been experiencing. So I'm going to take you on some of the key highlights of my race, my journey. Moments when I felt a gap in my identity that resulted in my intentional review and analysis of the past in order to understand better my situation. What I learned and how I processed this new knowledge into my identity psyche. Now, these aren't necessarily in order of hierarchy, but they are in terms of the historical sequence and the depth of the journey back into the past I had to return to in order to properly analyze them. They represent key moments of transcendence in the understanding and belonging to my identity. One of the major situations that reveals the differences between the identities of peoples is when one is living outside of his or her home nation, and the major shift that they come across when they return back home, be it for a short visit or an extended one. I was fortunate. I would go back to Kuwait often. Such a regular relocation would constantly expose me to the many gatherings of family and friends, gatherings that were both cyclical and highly necessary to attend. These gatherings, such as the one at my grandfather's house, would include extended family members numbering between 40 to 50 individuals back in the early 1980s. And today, that number is much closer to 200 in total. I think you know very well the types of gatherings I'm talking about. Such a gathering would then be complemented by different gatherings in the evenings during the week where my father and male family members would gather at my grandfather's or other senior family members' duaniyas, your majalis. And with the many times of the back and forth of travels between where I had lived at the time, a place with no relatives and a few Arab friends, and back home where overwhelming gatherings were the recurrent norm, I realized that this was a special practice of family and community back home. Everyone felt an urge and a need to come together, to see each other, to make sure all were in great health and spirit. It was a true reflection of the idiom, strength in numbers. So I began to question, where did this state of being come from? When was it established in us that togetherness was a vital part of our existence? I mean, for sure, nothing could be more servient to identity than not only belonging to a shared common characteristics, but also being physically together on a regular basis when those shared characteristics of people are engaged, reconfirmed, and they're strengthened. Was this a byproduct of our Muslim faith that positioned community as a vital element of the Islamic experience and support system? In Muhammad al-Bukhari's book of Hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet says, a believer to another believer is like a building whose different parts support each other? How can one iteration of what that building could signify not be community or even identity? How can we ignore community when one of the pillars of Islam, salat, that's prayer, is preferred when performed in communion? Or could it be a remnant of our tribal past that preceded Islam, where the interdependency of people necessitated a constant proximity of family and tribe, moving together as one to stay strong, being together to be able to collectively orchestrate the necessary tasks and demands of life? Strength in numbers to repel attack, and strength in numbers to overcome the harsh climate and to create civilizations that would ultimately represent the largest empire of the world, the Islamic Empire. Ibn Khaldun, in his book Al-Muqaddimah, talks in depth about the element of asabiyya, the intense togetherness and solidarity of a people that will become a prime factor in the creation of power centers of civilization. We even see such togetherness in current days. We see this phenomenon with Gulf Arabs when on vacations in foreign lands, they seem to gravitate towards each other to reflect a modern interpretation of safety, security, familiarity, and again, strength in numbers. So community was an essential real manifestation of my Arab identity. It is both an Arab and an identity attribute. In modernity, being an individual rose to prominence, yes, but there was as great, if not greater importance in the value of family, community, and ultimately a belonging to something much greater than oneself. Growing up, I had felt this belonging, and now I had recognized that multiple historical factors reconfirmed its importance to me, and how family, community, and solidarity had shaped a significant part of my mental image. One of the most vivid memories of growing up was when I would visit my grandparents. This memory involves me sitting with my grandmother while she was cooking in the external kitchen of her home. She'd be cooking, but she'd also be telling me stories. Stories of how her life was back in her youth, the simplicity of life and the struggles that came with it. Those moments were precious to me. I wasn't sure why at the time, but I would thereafter come to discover the reasons. Later in life, in a moment of recollection, I realized that it wasn't only my grandmother who had told me stories and triggered my imaginations. It was a vast array of family members and friends whose sharing of stories exhibited the same passion. A subsequent moment of self-discovery, I realized I was the same way. But my new realization was that I wasn't only the same as my grandmother and family members, but that I was a part of a long line of storytellers. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that I traced back each and every generation of my family as storytellers. No, I'm referring to my Arab ancestry, a history that comes with a long-standing oral tradition. And that clarity triggered in me a curiosity. Where does this oral tradition come from? How did it shape who I am today? And in my subsequent research, I arrived to the pre-Islamic era when the oral tradition was the norm in relaying stories and recording narratives. With the discovery of the poetry of Imru al-Qais, al-Nabigha, Antar ibn Shaddad, and al-Mutanabbi, I came to realize that qasida, or odes, spoke of the complex impressions of the tribal Arab society between the 3rd and the 10th century. Their words told of the stories, traditions, and relationships between the various people of the times. This oral tradition was constructing a mental image of identity, relayed for every and each generation in antiquity. Fast forward to the rise of Islam, and we see oral tradition take a different yet vital role in the continuity and expansion of the faith. For almost a century, the Quran goes unwritten, preserved and shared by those who have memorized it in its entirety, hence recited orally for decades and decades and beyond. Even the hadiths, the sayings and guidance of the Prophet, go on for centuries without even a thought or suggestion to write them, to put them in written form. And when they're finally comprehensively compiled, some 2 centuries later, we bear witness to the chain of narrations and the oral ancestry of their recollection. So-and-so heard it from so-and-so, who said it to so-and-so, who heard or saw the actions of the Prophet. In the Arab world, centuries would pass, and the method of sharing identity was yet to remain embedded in the practice of oral tradition. even as other regions across the world shifted their habits towards the documentation of stories and traditions in written form, Arabs would continue on with oral tradition up until the middle of the 20th century. This is not to say that Arabs also didn't partake in the documentation of some of their stories in written form, but oral tradition was still a major and powerful mechanism and force in relaying identity, because the reality of Arabs up till the middle of the 20th century was that they were still mostly agrarian, Bedouin, and nomadic in lifestyle. Also, unfortunately, characterized with low literacy rates, and hence the oral tradition was still the most prevalent of means to tell a story or relay a message. Even then, poetry and the telling of stories and narratives orally kept strong and still does, up till this very day. And it's this power of oral tradition and vocal storytelling that not only was something I personally loved and enjoyed both performing and listening to, but it was also an attribute intricately woven into my identity DNA. We are made to tell stories, to share what we know about who we are with whomever is ready to listen. And it's our duty to carry this forward into modernity through our own means and expressions. Living for long periods in the West, I always wondered why there was this primitive impression of Arabs, a misunderstood belief that we were still a wild and uncontrollable people, that we were to be feared. And I felt this even more sharply while living in non-cosmopolitan locations, where the impressions of Arabs and their identity seemed unchanged for a long time, more aligned with how the West felt about the Arab world in the early 20th century, and perhaps even earlier into the past. Where were these impressions coming from? They were vastly outdated and, more importantly, totally false. And it's at this point when I started to contemplate the mystery by looking into my recorded past, the documented history of the Arab people over the last 3 centuries. We all know the concept of history is written by the victors. It's an aphorism inaccurately credited to Winston Churchill. And what the statement suggests is that what is considered factual history is not necessarily a true reflection of the happenings and events of the times, but a version that serves those who were in power at the time. This statement does indeed apply to our part of the Middle East quite extensively, not because we were the victors or the losers. We just didn't write our history. Well, not up until fairly recently. Back then, we were engaged with more important elements of life, like survival. And if our history was indeed written by our own, then these books were few and far in between. When we return back to the first documented history books that shed light on early modern era Arab culture and civilization, most go back to the days of Napoleon and his conquest of Egypt in the late 18th century, during the age of Orientalism, when it became interesting for the West to rediscover this part of the world and explain it as per their interpretations. Our behavior, our faith, our lifestyle, and so on were all under their microscope. It was the Orientalists who created an image of Arabs for the consumption of their own people and as a foundation for their own agendas. This followed with other colonial powers jockeying for positions within the region by sending their military personnel or trade emissaries who documented our lives through their reports, diaries, and at times even fiction over the course of the next 150 years. They further pushed the narrative on Arabs through their own expressions and storytelling, be it with fantastical writings and with some, even misrepresentative art. The added shock with this phenomenon is that when we look deeply at our own history books and research papers generated over the last 100 years, where do you think they find and reference most of their earliest sources? You guessed it, from the same Orientalist papers, writings, and documentation. Edward Said stated it best in his book, Orientalism. What we learn about ourselves is actually gained from an inaccurate impression of a foreigner about our own ancestors. Published in 1978, Said's book questioned the whole premise of how the West created inaccurate impressions and narratives concerning the East, and how we struggle as Arabs in also understanding who we are because we do so mostly through foreign eyes. lenses, and stories that are not only misrepresentations, but ones that appear to have a negative agenda as well as a limited understanding of who we are. My moment of clarity came with the awareness that a big portion of the recent Arab past was incorrectly portrayed to a significant majority of non-Arabs. Not only that, but Arabs themselves owned a blurred and restricted vision of their own history. And this was the most unpleasant realization I had of looking at the past to understand better my belonging. Part of our Arab identity is that we are misrepresented. We lost a war of historiography we weren't really involved with. There is a part of our past that we can't truly access because the past is either inaccurate or irreparably out of focus, to say the least. Yet still, as upsetting as this was, there were still upsides to this finding. That we must push for the constant questioning of that missing history, where we not only question, but we start to tell our own version of our own stories with our words. But also, by uncovering the past, we must remove the narratives that give inaccurate readings of how we were and why we were that way. We must revisit our history to discover its true nature, and then maybe even to possibly rewrite it. The fourth discovery came at the culmination of my higher educational studies. As an architectural student, history of architecture was one of the mandatory courses I had to take. In it, the professor would present and examine the various landmark sites and buildings throughout history. Arab architecture in Western educational curricula was limited to a handful of examples at most: the Holy Kaaba in Mecca, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and the ancient city of Petra in Jordan made the cut. And the rest of the important local landmarks were not really attributed to Arabs, be them Mesopotamian or ancient Egyptian. And the vast majority of the remaining historic sites were considered remnants from Western civilizations, such as the Greeks, Romans, or the Crusaders. There was a major lack of representation of what I could identify with architecturally speaking. And that void only grew as my architectural education came to a close. And upon moving back to my region is when I discovered what its local architecture was all about. I came across the range of architectural applications that were rich and beautiful. Tightly woven urban organizations that house buildings mainly of a variety of Adobe construction. Adobe systems that adjusted their designs and construction composition depending on the proximity to the salty seas or not. In parallel, I was exposed to other urban systems that were carved out of the sides of rocky hills and mountains. Urban design and architectural solutions that responded to a scarcity of raw materials that also adapted to extremely harsh environmental conditions. So, how did these realizations of buildings and tangible visual triggers impact my identity? Well, if one extracts all the styles and methods away from the urban design and architecture, what remains and comes through was the will and innovation of the people. The ability of our ancestors who were able to defy scorching temperatures and extreme day and night variances with intelligent and cunning solutions. It is the composition of simple materials into complex construction systems that allowed for the tolerance of the unbearable heat. It was the management of light and shadow that impressed upon me and reflected a much more complex design thought process. It was the introduction of airflow and its intentional redirection that inspired my thoughts. The perseverance of identity was reflected in all these creations. These buildings were as impressive and had much to offer in the ingenuity of design as any other global landmark. Scale and difficulty of construction shouldn't be the sole factor that qualifies buildings or landmarks as great and worth analysis. And hence, my pride in my people's innovations in architecture became equal to that of all internationally recognized monuments, cathedrals, and buildings of other global civilizations. Not only was it pride that came with this realization of innovation associated with the ancient Arab peoples and their architecture, but it was also a testament to how their fine-tuned identity played an important role in the creativity and quality of design that was generated at the time. The role of innovation as a mainstay of Arab identity is proven throughout history. No one could take that away from us. As I mentioned, early in my life, I subconsciously resorted to satisfying the cravings of identity through the exposure to any and all mediums available to me. One such medium was television. By the 1970s, the quantity of Arab content available was mainly generated by nations like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Some content had also started trickling in from Kuwait. All great and wonderful productions that did indeed relate to my sense of self, but again, I still felt something missing. Then in the mid-1980s, I came upon a TV show that was considered a Kuwaiti classic, Darb al-Zelig. The English translation for the title being A Slippery Road. It seemed familiar. Had I seen it before? I wasn't sure. The truth of the matter was that Darb al-Zelig had been produced almost 7 years earlier, in 1977. So most likely I had been exposed to it in some shape or form, but it hadn't triggered in me any curiosity or need to fully engage with at the time. So maybe I was simply too young to understand its message. Darb al-Zelig, if you're not aware, is a comedy show about two brothers who go from the humble beginnings of poverty during the fledgling era of Kuwait to a moment when they are granted new wealth with Kuwait's policy of the distribution of the nation's wealth amongst its people. This new wealth kickstarts dreams of creating multiplied wealth and prosperity in the younger brother Hussein. And the adventure ensues when he takes his family onto get-rich-quick schemes that fail miserably. It's more than a comedy, though. It's a human story. It's a story reflecting the times and the mentalities that came out of poverty, out of a simplicity that then leapt into a modern nation state with all the innocence and ignorance one might imagine. This show was a great success, not only in Kuwait, but at the very least across the Arabian Gulf and into Iraq, even beyond possibly. This classic of expression was able to grasp the spirit of life of the times. Kuwait's zeitgeist from the 1950s till the time the show aired, including the feelings and psyche of the people, the socio-economic transition, and the simplicity of the past that was now being challenged by the complexity and brutality of the future. The writing was sharp and intelligent, even though colloquial and simple. The humor was unrelenting, yet both in your face and surprisingly subtle. The performances couldn't be more real and humane. You felt the raw emotions of each and every character. It was truly an amazing orchestration and reflection of art imitating life. And for me, when I became aware later in my life, in watching and rewatching this show, and in becoming exposed to non-Arab cultural expressions around the world, was that Darb al-Zelig was an international trailblazer. It either immediately followed or preceded similar highly successful shows out of the United States and the United Kingdom that had the same substantial impact on their own cultures and identity. In the United States, it was Sanford and Son, which aired in the early 1970s. While in the United Kingdom, the similar show was Only Fools and Horses that debuted in 1981. Shows that spoke about a couple of ambitious men who wanted to break free of their poverty and would do anything possible to realize that dream, even if it was at the expense of their limited wealth and health. The takeaway from this trip into the recent past revealed that Arabs were worldly in their expression of their identity, in their creativity within the arts, and in their ability to observe and recognize the signs of the times, even though they had only recently been exposed to modernity in general, and the performing arts and television in specific, able to generate content that was second to none when it came to writing and producing film, television, theater, and music. And yes, it's also linked to the attribute of storytelling. But now, the mediums had exponentially changed. No longer was it oral tradition, it was also now visual. And in both, it was clear that we could do wonders. By the way, if you haven't seen Darb al-Zelig, I highly recommend it. It's a universal story that belongs to our part of the world. Now, just to reiterate, these are my highlights, my personal examples, reduced to 5 in number. They definitely don't represent the breadth of my journey, and they also don't represent the highlights of your own potential personal journey of discovery, even though some of my recollections and their findings might trigger in you the same clarity that they did unto me. My experience and journey with identity has led me to achieve a much higher sense of self. And with this achievement, as I have just shed light about the 5 highlights of my identity journey, this new sense of belonging manifested itself into me in prioritizing community by having an ambition of belonging to an existence greater than oneself and within a group that shares one's characteristics and belief. To becoming a storyteller, just like the Arab orators of old, with the sharing of my stories and in the relaying of my self-image. In realizing that even a significant gap in our history, nothing should hold us back in retelling our story through our lens and words. Into innovating and designing experiences that can live up to not only a local, but a global audience, as Arab architects did in antiquity. And finally, in being able to recognize the sign of the times to create and express ideas, as did the show Darb al-Zelig just a few decades ago. And in consequence of all these insights into my identity came the establishment of the Kinderi Chronicles, my YouTube channel, where sharing stories extracted from my identity with others who share the same hunger, interest for discovery, and the migration of knowledge can be found. And funny enough, this is why I'm here standing before you today, because of my curiosity in examining my past and in the sharing of my identity. One myth I want to alleviate, though, is that this journey is not a daunting process. It also shouldn't be an exhaustive process. It should be an exercise filled with curiosity, openness, and fun. It will take time to self-contemplate and assimilate the many attributes that might not be currently shaping your identity. Remember what I had said earlier, that we don't deeply analyze our identity or think about the experiences that trigger our memories. It has to start with the creation of a new habit, one where we analyze our actions, thoughts, and beliefs, or those of others around us. We observe how and why these actions or thoughts are taking shape. What is their historical source within our belief, societal, and behavioral systems? I reiterate, establishing a habit to invigorate our identity will only result in positive outcomes. And this habit starts with an intention to upgrade our mental self-image, taking it from one threshold to the next. The habit continues with attempts to engage with conscious examinations of the present by referring to the past, so that our identity fine-tunes and perseveres. And finally, it culminates with the sharing with our children and family the broader concepts and findings, so that they have the general understandings while also allowing them room to formulate their own personal associations. What joins us as Arab Muslims is that we are fortunate enough to have a major weapon at our disposal that protects us from quick and inevitable change. And that is a great situation to be in when one wants to preserve and empower identity. It's not our conservatism, that does help a little, but it's actually our togetherness. You can call it our social oneness, a oneness that operates on both the conscious and subconscious mind, on the mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. Again, I remind you of Ibn Khaldun and his concept of asabiyya, the collective spirit and solidarity. And it's a powerful weapon because it operates on 2 frequencies. The first frequency is specific to tribal ancestry, collective memory, and instinct, where there's a necessity on retaining tradition while also constantly seeking social cohesion. On the second frequency, it's religion. And in the context of most Arabs, that's the Muslim faith, and its prioritization of a conservatism while also promoting social unity, be it amongst family or larger communities that help us in keeping our notion of self strong. Both frequencies promote solidarity, values, belonging, and a unified characters, all attributes necessary for a fine-tuned identity and its preservation. The final question we have to ask ourselves, is a powerful identity worth the effort? From my perspective, this question is rhetorical. Otherwise, we're not a unique people that offer great richness to the collective culture of the world. We have a responsibility to protect our collective identity, and we start by constantly flexing our own by learning from the past. And the next layer is to relay this method to the next generation so that their journey in life is founded upon a stronger and more confident identity. And thereafter, they might reap the rewards of such a preferred position in their journey in life. So I know I've gone on for long now, but this is my final bit. I ask you to give it a try. Give it a try. Try to empower your identity by learning from the past. And then you'll be left with 4 positive takeaways. Understand why you operate the way you do by looking at history, deeply analyzing it, to then discover the real elements of the past that manifest themselves in your identity today. Sharply hone your opinions on situations of life, be them social, professional, or other, due to your identity edges coming into better focus. Gaining new levels of kinship will result in added sympathy for your people and others, because now you have the tools to extract the historical reasons for their actions, actions that might contradict your own. And finally, empower yourself by achieving a higher confidence and pride in your identity and its value to not only yourself, but to your family and children, as well as to your larger community. Thank you.